And welcome to the second lecture on expected inflation, where we're going to be discussing interest rate rules. And, well, may as well just get started from here. So, we talked about optimal interest rate rules in the past, what interest rate is best for the economy, what interest rate maximizes consumer welfare, right? Because if you set them too high, the economy doesn't grow right. If you set them too low, then you have high inflation. If we go with like what Milton Friedman said, right? Because money is costly to hold relative to bonds because bonds are interest bearing assets and money isn't, right? So going by that logic, if we follow Friedman's theory, then the idea would have been to set the nominal interest rate at zero. Therefore, we would have a real interest rate equal to the rate of deflation, which makes money cost less to hold relative to bonds. Because if you hold money, you get a rate of deflation equal to negative pi, and that would be equal to what you would get if you hold bonds, which would be a real interest rate R, right? So, according to Friedman, there was a Goldilocks zone. We could have used Friedman's rule, but we learned why it wasn't ever implemented because, namely, there are issues with keeping interest rates too low, and when a central bank has the ability to have effects on real economic variables in the short to medium term, maybe we should consider setting the interest rate somewhat above zero. So, if we're not going to use his rule, what rule should we use? Well, the central bank kind of follows like an interest rate setting rule of thumb. It's not like an explicit rule that they have to follow, but if you were to analyze the rule, like kind of look at it and parameterize it in certain ways, you can see it actually fits the way interest rates evolve over time quite well. So, this rule, right, would allow for the rate to be set in order to stabilize inflation, support economic growth, and not be too high. I kind of sound like a spokesman from the Federal Reserve there, but I assure you I do not work for the Federal Reserve. Although this rule is called the Taylor Rule, named after John Taylor in his 1993 paper where he introduced this function. So, how do we get the Taylor Rule? Well, let's start out with the Fisher equation. All right, we've all seen this, and it says that the nominal rate is equal to the real rate plus that of inflation. And, we know this fairly well at this point. Let's go ahead and relax some of the assumptions around the classical dichotomy, which means that we will no longer be analyzing real and nominal variables separately, because in the short to medium term, the classical dichotomy doesn't hold. It holds in the long run, but not necessarily in the short run. We're also going to be relaxing the assumption of monetary neutrality. Therefore, changes to the money supply will be affecting real economic variables. And now we're going to think of this as like an interest rate setting rule for the central bank. So instead of this just being the Fisher equation, we're going to let capital R, the nominal interest rate, be what the central bank is trying to set based on where the real rate is and where the rate of inflation is. But how do you know anything more about the state of the economy? How do you know about where inflation is relative to where it should be? How do you know how the real economy is performing relative to where it should be? You can't really get that out of the Fisher equation. So let's make a couple of modifications to it because deviations in GDP from potential GDP is going to matter, right? So potential GDP is this figure that's released that says essentially what GDP would/should be. All right, would be absent shocks, should be if everything were kind of ideal. Sometimes we're above potential, sometimes we're below potential. But deviations in that will matter if the Federal Reserve is setting interest rates in order to try to affect real economic variables. So large deviations from potential GDP would trigger more drastic changes in monetary policy. Also, let's say deviations of inflation from an inflation target will also be affecting how you set interest rates. If inflation gets too high, obviously you're going to want to increase inflation rates to increase interest rates, to get the inflation rate down. But inflation that's low isn't always a good thing either, right? Because if the economy's doing well and inflation's at 1% instead of 2%, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Well, actually, no, it can be. Because if inflation gets too low, it begins to alter inflation expectations. It can affect how banks make loans and limit the Fed's ability to conduct monetary policy, which we've discussed in the previous video. So we've decided from here, you want to set rates based on how the economy's doing and the current inflation rate. And if you want to do that, you need to look at both output and prices. So from the Fisher equation, we can consider an inflation gap, right? Pi minus pi star. Pi star is the inflation target. Pi is observed inflation. We can consider how much we care about the inflation gap, in which case we multiply that inflation gap by a parameter alpha pi, which is greater than 0. There's an output gap that we're going to be concerned about, deviations in actual observed real GDP from potential real GDP, and how much we care about that output gap. And again, we multiply that gap, instead of by alpha pi, it's by alpha y, which is greater than 0. So we add these two sets of deviations in order to get this guy right here. Equation 3 is the Taylor rule. This is what John Taylor in 1993 developed to describe how the Federal Reserve was setting interest rates. His original formulation was pretty close to what was actually happening, and what he did is he set these two parameters on the inflation and output gaps equal to 1/2. And what that implies is that policymakers care as much about inflation as they do output. Now, if they care more about inflation than output, they're considered to be hawkish on inflation. If they care more about output than inflation, they're considered to be dovish on inflation. And we've had Fed chairs that have been extraordinarily dovish. We've had Fed chairs that have been relatively hawkish in the past. And a lot of times you can have Fed chairs that are generally hawkish on inflation be rather dovish in some of their policies, just given the state of the economy. So how does a Taylor rule fit the data overall? Well, if we're going to be super precise, it depends on the regime, because if the economy's in a slump, you'll probably see some more dovish policy, and if the economy's doing well, you might tend to see more hawkish policy, but it's not always true, because sometimes the economy can be in a slump and inflation is very high, and you don't want dovish policy when the economy is not doing well and you have high inflation. It's what's known as stagflation, and it requires extremely tight monetary policy. This actually happened in the early 1980s with Paul Volcker as Fed chair. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, the U.S. economy had like double-digit inflation rates and extremely high unemployment. And in, I believe it was like 1981 or 82, Paul Volcker massively increased interest rates, cut the money supply, and it threw the economy into a very short recession. However, when the economy came out, inflation was stabilized, and you actually had a good bit of economic prosperity through the 80s and 90s. So, really, all that aside, probably need to consider plotting out the Taylor rule and see how it fits. So how do I do this? Well, I take data from the Federal Reserve Economic Database. I take the natural log of real GDP, the natural log of potential real GDP, the core PCE inflation rate, which is the inflation rate the Federal Reserve uses, the target federal funds rate, and all this data span 1982 to 2022 at the quarterly frequency. And I formulate the Taylor rule as this guy right here. Now, this looks a little different, just a tad different, because I've got RT star rather than the real rate plus inflation. But the federal funds rate, the target federal funds rate, is the nominal target federal funds rate, in which case that is the real interest rate plus that of inflation. So that RT star actually captures the first two terms in equation 3. And when I plot it out, this is what I get. And it actually fits pretty well. We've got some areas where the federal funds rate is a little bit below what the Taylor rule suggests. We've got some areas where it's a little bit above. Now, if you want to look at this period and then this period, so 2008 to 2016 and then 2020 up until about 2021, 2022, we had the Taylor rule actually negative. Now, the Federal Reserve has no interest in actually holding interest rates below 0. That's why it's referred to as the zero lower bound in the United States. So they had to resort to some other unconventional monetary policy to still be able to be considered quote-unquote effective. However, if they didn't do that, the alternative would be a negative interest rate policy, in which case the federal funds rate probably would have been somewhat close to what the Taylor rule is suggesting here. So just interesting food for thought. So it fits well in some areas, maybe not so well in others. It kind of sucks through the 80s, but there's a good reason for that because there wasn't really like an explicit inflation target, and the federal funds rate that the targeted federal funds rate wasn't ever really like officially announced. There's some weird stuff going on. And it sucks between 2008 and 2016, and it really 2020, but more on this later. So to show where there are problems, let's plot like the error, right? So I'm going to take the Taylor rule and subtract the Fed funds rate. Where it's positive, the Taylor rule overpredicted the Fed funds rate. Where it's negative, it's underpredicted. And this is what I get. So generally, it's pretty consistently close to zero. Some areas where it gets a little high, some areas where it gets a little low. But looking at this, you can kind of see during the financial crisis and during the coronavirus pandemic, when that thing hit, there were some areas where the Fed funds rate should have been a little bit lower, maybe a little bit higher than where it actually was, especially when you look here, right, through 2021 and 2022, the Taylor rule is quite a bit higher than the federal funds rate, which means if we were to have been following the Taylor rule, the Fed funds rate probably should have been a good bit higher than what it actually was. But that's something we've also seen with the Federal Reserve kind of dragging their feet on raising interest rates, and then you end up with the issue that we have now of rather high inflation. So why would there be some error? Well, the first obvious answer is structural change, because there's no explicit inflation target in the 80s or 90s. We had the financial crisis of 2008, COVID in 2020, and in these cases, especially the latter two, we've got ourselves in a situation where typical policy measures wouldn't work as well. And the Fed would need to use some other tools in order to achieve their desired outcomes. So all we did is just assume the parameters were equal to 1/2. Had some areas a good fit, areas a bad fit. But let's estimate this. Let's estimate a linear regression. So we're going to use ordinary least squares in order to do so. And I want to estimate this guy right here, equation 5. Unfortunately, I can't like this. But what I can do is put my thinking cap on, and I can assume that the target Fed funds rate and the target inflation rate will be equal to the constant term that gets observed in this estimation. So it's just going to be the target Fed funds rate plus the target inflation rate, which would give us something like this guy here. And finally, we can simplify this output gap as just YT with a little tilde over it to give us our final specification of this guy right here. Now this we can actually estimate. And when I estimate it, this is what I get. I get 1.25 for inflation, and I get 0.37 for output. If I plot it out, this is what we get. Now, that's nowhere near as nice of a fit as what we saw with Taylor's initial parameterization. And there are some good reasons for this. Most of the reasons are entirely econometric. So I don't want to get into it because this isn't an econometrics course. If you've had econometrics and you're interested in discussing it, please, let me know. We can do a one-on-one chat. But we do learn one interesting thing from this. If we look at the coefficient on inflation, it's larger than 1. It tells us if the inflation rate increases by 1%, the Fed responds by increasing the interest rate by more than 1%. This is what's known as the Taylor principle, and it states the central bank should be increasing their policy rate by more than 1-for-1 to respond to fluctuations in the inflation rate. And we can actually even see this in the original Taylor formulation. So if we start with Taylor's formulation, and we group some like terms, namely inflation, and I got it color-coded here so you can kind of see what's going on. All I did was just expand what's in the parentheses, and then I added inflation together to get 1 plus alpha pi times pi, which implies the Taylor principle, because this is saying if inflation is going to be increasing by, say, 1%, it's going to suggest the Federal Reserve should be increasing their federal funds rate by more than 1%. So from the Taylor rule, if inflation increases by 1 percentage point, the Federal Reserve is going to raise the nominal rate by more than 1 percentage point. Because given this alpha pi is larger than 0, if inflation increases by 1 percentage point, the nominal rate's increased by more than 1 percentage point. So the Fed's going to want to take drastic measures to keep inflation around 2%. So if the Fed can signal they're aiming for an inflation rate within their target, inflation expectations can be anchored to be around the actual inflation rate. And remember that it's a good thing when inflation is equal to expected inflation. So from this Taylor rule, these parameterizations, like I said, can vary over different times, different Fed chairs, different points in the business cycle, etc. For example, former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke claimed to follow a rule of alpha y equals 1 and alpha pi equals 0.25, which means he cared much more about getting output back to potential GDP than he did about inflation increasing. However, we had a period of very low inflation during this period. So let's try his Taylor rule from 2003 to 2020. And the reason I'm using this period is I want to get a couple years before the financial crisis and then a couple years after. So I'm going to use this, and I've got my target federal funds rate, core inflation, target inflation rate, and I'm parameterizing alpha y to 1 and alpha pi to 0.25, just like Bernanke did during his tenure. Note that former FOMC Chair Janet Yellen, who immediately preceded Ben Bernanke, also claims to have used this formulation, and the data supports the claim, as she was in from, I believe, 2013 up until 2018. So this is what we get. So you got the Taylor rule, we got the federal funds rate. We can see the Taylor rule should be much below zero during the financial crisis, and then throughout a couple of rounds of quantitative easing, it should also have been below zero. However, the rounds of quantitative easing you can sort of think of as like an alternative to a negative interest rate policy. So when interest rates aren't bound below by zero, the Taylor rule fits the Fed funds rate pretty well. And why would we care about this? Well, the Fed manages interest rates via monetary policy. And when they do this, they can really only affect short-term rates when they're above the zero lower bound. If interest rates need to go lower and the Fed doesn't want to go below zero, then the Fed needs some other policy tools. Because if interest rates are this low and nothing is done about it with low inflation like what we had here, right? We had very low inflation really throughout the financial crisis and then the periods that followed of quantitative easing, and inflation didn't really become a problem up until about a year ago, when after the COVID pandemic had really started to slow and the Federal Reserve should have been increasing interest rates and didn't, as well as some rather loose fiscal stimulus going on as well, you tend to get rather high inflation. But that's besides the point. Because if the Fed isn't going to do anything about like trying to use different policy tools, managing the Fed funds rate isn't going to be effective at the zero lower bound. And they have to go to other policy tools if they want to guide inflation expectations in real economic activity. And this is where quantitative easing comes into play. What happened is they purchased long-term bonds rather than short-term, and they substantially increased the money base, because at the zero lower bound, if you remember, what happens to money demand when the nominal interest rate approaches zero, the demand for money becomes infinite. And, we saw this with the graph for the demand and supply of money, and we also saw this with the demand function, especially given the money and the utility function demand for money that we had. So what does the Fed do? Well, instead of buying short-term treasuries to impact short-term interest rates, they buy long-term treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities to try to affect long-term rates. This is what's known as flattening the yield curve. And it means if short-term rates are already low, they target long-term rates instead. And in doing so, they buy a lot of long-term treasury and mortgage-backed securities to make it happen. This massively expands their balance sheet by turning a lot of these long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities into excess reserves, thus increasing the money base. And this is what it looks like. So throughout these 3 rounds of quantitative easing, you can see the amount of securities that the Federal Reserve purchased spiked dramatically, got up to about $4.2 trillion. And they did this via the creation of excess reserves. So you can see as securities held by the Federal Reserve are increasing, reserve balances are also increasing by similar amounts. And then after quantitative easing, well, really around 2018 or so, they began to try to let their balance sheet kind of like let some of these things wind down from their balance sheet and try to return to more normal monetary policy measures. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic of 2020 happened, and they just massively increased their balance sheet again. But I don't really plan on getting into that here because, well, there's a lot that needs to go into it. It's probably going to get a couple of lectures on its own, and I'm going to try not to voice my opinion here too much. But in doing so, right, when they're using this unconventional monetary policy, they can still use monetary policy to guide the expected future path of interest rates, which then guides the expected future path of inflation. So even in a recession with very low interest rates, the idea would be the Fed could still use their policy to guide the public's expectation about the path of the economy, which then affects inflation expectations. So when the Fed was engaging in similar behavior during the COVID pandemic, right, they increased their balance sheet to like over $6 trillion. There began being some questions asked about the limits of monetary expansion, especially in a high inflation environment like what we have now, and how the central bank should be reacting to high inflation relative to how they are acting to high inflation environments. And with this, I am going to wrap up this particular lecture. Thank you for sitting in, and there will be more coming shortly. Thank you.